Walking along a path at the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road towards the Anselm Society digital pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and, well, whatever we want to talk about. In the corner by the fire are two people. One of them is talking about Ken's kiss, and that's a story for another time. And that's me, your host, Christina Brown. Welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories so that we can better understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. For as long as humans have existed, we have struggled with the idea of boundaries. And arguably one of the biggest boundaries, and utterly insurmountable one, is the boundary that time presents. We often feel chained to its ever-progressing march, struck by the pain of not being able to return to poignant moments or to push a pause button, to soak in one last day, one last moment with a loved one before they die. Why is time so elusive, and yet so painfully present in our everyday lives? And yet, what if instead of feeling trapped by time, we could be freed within it? And what if those very feelings of entrapment are inner markers, telling us that our eternality as humans is more than a mere doctrinal reality? What if time and our experience of it reveals a freedom and a hope bigger and broader than our own consciousness will allow? Today we will be talking with Jane Scharl, one of the editors and essayists in the Anselm Society's brand new and inaugural book, Why We Create. She addresses all these questions and more, and one of the most brilliantly compiled chapters on this topic that I've yet encountered. Jane, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
We're so happy to have you.
I'm delighted to be here.
Good. So you wrote a chapter in our newest book entitled Time and Its Creator. I know when the Anselm leadership was initially conceptualizing the content of this book, you were excited to volunteer your writing prowess to this chapter. So what makes you so passionate about this topic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I probably the thing that most draws me to this topic is I love science. I'm not a scientist at all. But I think when I was studying in college, I studied philosophy, and I noticed how the early philosophers were all also scientists, and the problems of time and space were just as important to them as problems of ontology, being, morality, and the relationship between science and philosophy just used to be a lot tighter. Now, the story about why that's no longer the case is long, but basically it's just that the amount of technical knowledge required now to actually make advances in science is so much that it's hard to master science and also work in philosophy. You do see people do it. It's a rare combination. It's always been a rare combination, but it's even more difficult today. So I love science. I'm not a scientist, would never aspire to be a scientist, but I like to read and study the popularized accounts of what's happening on the edges of science, because we're living in a really interesting era for the way we think about the world at the micro level and the macro level. Mm-hmm. Questions of scale are so interesting right now if you follow science. And time is in a way, it's a physical question. It's a question of physics, and we're seeing that more and more. So me, coming from sort of a background in classical philosophy, whenever there's a breakthrough in physics, I tend to think, oh, well, that's a theological insight as well. So nice. There's got to be some sort of interplay between those two. So in my very amateur reading about the physics of time, I get really excited about what are the anthropological and theological insights we can make here. And then I'm always trying to pull people back to the moral insights. How are we supposed to live? What do we do in relationship to these things? So that's sort of where it all started.
I love it. That's fantastic. And I want to get a little bit into the scientific side of that in a little bit. And right now, what I really want for our listeners is to delve them into the first part of your chapter because I think it's one of the most brilliant ways that I've started a chapter. I've heard a chapter on time. So I'm quite convinced, believe to see, listeners, that after I read this, you're going to want to read the rest of it yourself. So without further ado, I quote, "Imagine this, a person, a woman on her knees, praying fervently. All her being is present in the prayer. Her body is poised as if to spring into action. Her face is fixed, though her eyes are closed. She is praying for a man, a relative of hers, who she knows is enduring brutal torments. He is being burned alive. She is praying for him, bringing all that she is to God to intercede for this man, that he may have joy and steadfast hope, that after all his tortures he would see salvation. Now imagine that that man had been burned to death 400 years prior. Yet the woman prays, and her prayer ascends, and God hears. And 400 years before the prayer is said, it is answered." Dun-dun-dun! Bam, chicka, boom!
Yeah.
That is just so fantastic.
I'm really glad you like it. It took me, I was really struggling with how to get into this essay because people don't really want to read about physics generally, especially physics by an absolute amateur. It's just not a very appealing topic, so you kind of get them. So full disclosure, as I disclose later in the essay, I completely mug this scene from Charles Williams.
Yep.
Who's one of the best writers on, I guess I would say the sublime, the mysteries of the sublime out there. He's just an absolute king on this stuff. So nice. That comes from his book Descent into Hell.
And he's one of the lesser known Inklings, right?
He is.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a great, there's an Inkling scholar, Serena Higgins, who calls him the oddest Inkling. He's just a strange fellow, and his path is worthy of its own podcast. But nice. He comes to Anglo-Catholicism after a long stint deep in the occult. So he brings this really, he knows that things matter and things are powerful, which it permeates all of his work. And so that's where you get some of the oddness, is just he has this hypersensitivity to power in the universe, which is really interesting.
That's really interesting.
Yeah,
I got goosebumps when I read that portion of your book. And so when you cited Williams in the rest of the, or later on in the chapter, I was thinking, I wonder, what was he like? Because that's quite a... Yeah.
He's a really interesting guy. And there are a number of good biographies about him. So if you want to learn more about him, there's plenty of reading to do. But one of my favorite anecdotes about him is he was a really lovely letter writer. So many people, he would sustain over decades these very warm and charitable and compassionate epistolatory relationships with people, where he was very deeply encouraging, and he loved to hear people's imaginative theological notions and then help them hone them. And because of his brush with the occult, it wasn't a brush, his immersion in the occult, he was always great about telling people, that's a great insight, and also cautioning them, you got to be careful because there are dark things out there as well. So his letters are delightful, and you wouldn't expect it when you read his novels. You'd think he'd be kind of gruff and a tough man, but it turns out he was a really tender, sweet guy. So
that's great.
Yeah, he's lovely.
Wow, that's great. Is this the first novel you'd recommend of his, or?
It's a great place to start.
Great place to start.
Yeah, okay. And then from there, A War in Heaven is kind of the pinnacle of his things, of his novels. It's pretty disturbing, though. It's the most explicitly about the occult. I just reread it, and I remembered why it had been 8 years between readings. Yeah. Okay. So, but Descent into Hell is I think it's kind of a must-read for Christians today.
Wow.
Yeah, Peter Craig says it's the most frightening book he's ever read.
Really?
And I see why.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. Well, you and Williams are not the only ones to posit these possibilities. But the theories about time and its properties are not theories, like you said, visited by theologians alone. But scientists, like you said, have also wrestled with this strange and elusive, like, reality that we indwell. And in your book, you mentioned a few of them. So, what can you tell us about one of them, Carlos Rovelli, and his work on the subject? But as you said, layman's terms, because
Sure.
Yeah, me and my poor non-metaphysics scientist self.
Same. So yeah, Carlo Rovelli's a really great one if you're interested in this stuff. He's really great to follow. His book, The Order of Time, came out in the last few years. Probably parts of it are already outdated because this research is moving quickly, but I don't know which parts because I'm not moving that quickly. But he is working. He's a theoretical physicist, and he's one of the founders of what's called the loop quantum gravity theory. So it's a great cocktail party conversation. You'll just sweep everyone off their feet. But actually, Rovelli is classically educated, and his book is highly readable. It's full of...
Oh, classically educated. Cool.
Yeah. It's full of anecdotes, and he's got a lot of just... He can turn a... He can do that thing that really great science writers can do, where they give you a super clear, understandable example, which is what science is. It's creating example situations and then testing them. Yeah. But he can do example situations that make sense to lay people, which is, with this sort of theoretical physics work, that's a really significant thing that he can do that. So I recommend that to anyone. The Order of Time. I recommend that to anybody who's interested in this stuff. It took me a long time to get through it, even though it's pretty slim. It's a tough book, but he's basically compiling late 20th century observations on time, and trying to relate the passage of time to particle theory. So, is time is related to light, in that time seems to be, basically it seems to be transfer of heat, which is what light is. So, when we talk about time, we're talking about the process by which heat transfers from one thing to the next. And that's such a boring description, but that's really what is basically happening at the lowest level from what we can tell. This is all theoretical, but it looks like...
A theoretical physicist.
Right.
Or metaphysicist.
Yeah, exactly. I know. And the line between the physics and the metaphysics is so narrow at this, in this kind of discipline. Yeah, so time seems to be the way we experience heat transfer. And when you start thinking about time that way, it's really just one step to see, oh my gosh, we're thinking about light in the same way. And light has these dual properties. As most people are now aware, light sometimes behaves like a wave and sometimes behaves like a particle. And physicists are still trying to understand what are the rules about how light behaves. And it would kind of seem that time sort of behaves in those different ways as well. Sometimes time behaves like a set of a really smoothly flowing series of heat transfers. And sometimes it's a lot more discrete and broken up, and you have these little stops in the way time flows. And you can see that where electrons will seem to leave time and then reappear in a different place, but the intervening time that seems necessary for them to get from one place to the other is gone. That's not a thing. But the heat transfer has occurred, but not in this smoothly flowing way that we would expect. Right. So that's sort of what we're talking about in a super, this is a layman talking about a layman's version.
Which is exactly what I asked for, so well done.
Yes.
But what is really interesting to me is that you put in, you took the idea of love, right? Which is God is love, and he created time and placed us within it for a reason. Yeah. Like, you took some of Carlos Rovelli's words and you replaced them with love. And I think that was a brilliant way to connect the theology and the science.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I hope that it's not doing violence to both of them.
Right. Sure.
But to me, because the biggest thing that we're seeing about time that to me feels compelling is that time is necessarily an interaction between two things. If you only have one thing in the universe and there's no heat transfer because all the heat is fixed in that one thing, there is no time. Time is a record of exchange between things. And to me, that clarifies a lot about why time came into being when God created other things.
Oh, interesting.
Because
I like that.
if there's one thing, the Godhead and the mystery of the Trinity, maybe there is some kind of time within the Trinity, but it would be, I mean, the analog between the two, the analogy doesn't exist. That doesn't make sense. So it makes sense if you've got one thing, the Godhead, and there's no transfer of heat, if you will, from the Godhead to anything else. And then God creates, and necessarily time would begin because now energy is passing in some mysterious way from the Godhead, the creator, into the created order. So, that was, I just wanted to play with that idea.
Yeah.
So where Ravelli writes in kind of his science way, he writes, elementary particles do not exist immersed in space. Rather, they themselves form that space. The spatiality of the world consists of the web of their interactions. They do not dwell in time. They interact incessantly with each other and indeed exist only in terms of these incessant interactions. And this interaction is the happening of the world. So I wanted to go through and I switched out the word interactions for love, and then rewrote the passage where it says, there are things that do not exist immersed in space. Rather, they themselves form that space. The spatiality of the world consists of the web of their love. They do not dwell in time. They incessantly love each other and indeed exist only in terms of this incessant love. And this love is the happening of the world.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and I think you pair it with the idea of chronos and kairos, and is it aion?
I would say eon.
Okay.
But I'm not a Greek scholar.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. But it's so interesting because, it takes us out of that, this is really like, what is this metaphysic weirdness, into like, well, hold on a second, because there's kairos, right? There's the time that, or the chronos, the time that we kind of indwell and that we're kind of talking about here. But then there's kairos, which is the time that we can't measure, those moments where we sort of step into a moment that seems to pause everything else for us. You mentioned children at play when they step into that moment where everything stops for them. And even this morning I had a moment where I was grieving just the loss of my mother, which is, their anniversary is about 3 years now, and stepped into the dining room and saw the flowers on my table. And all of a sudden, I stopped in my tracks, and the sunflowers themselves were glowing, like with the light of the sun. And like without warning, I just thought of the streets of gold in Jerusalem, and I thought that the sharp-edged petals felt like a crown, like of that God's saints will wear. And I just had this moment of solace that just took me out of the moment and put me in an eternal state of mind. And I just, so there are moments like that kind of stop us in our tracks, and place us elsewhere, forward and backwards, and which I want to go to this too, after we talk about a little bit of the kairos and chronos down here, but you do say later that time is not as linear as we might think. So anyway, so I kind of want to get into that, but can you just give a brief little
Sure. Yeah. Well, I want to say I have been reproached for this passage by a good friend of mine. So it's possible that I have a misreading here. We had a great discussion about it. It's really funny. You gotta have friends, by the way, who, if you're writing, you gotta have friends who are smarter than you, who can call you and say, I really liked your essay, except you totally messed with this part. Well, that's great, because it's already published.
Thanks for that.
But I'm also not sure if he's correct, but whatever. There is disagreement on this. There are, but the point stands that within English, we have one word for time, really, that we use regularly. And then all of our other words for time are divisions of that time. We've got year, month, week, hour, minute. But those things aren't really a new understanding of time. They're just a piece of time, that word time. But then in many other languages, not just in Greek, but in many languages, there are words for different experiences of time, different kinds of time. And I think it's hard to explain this in English because when you don't have the word for it, that consciousness doesn't, you don't have that label in your imagination. But in Greek, there's these 3 different words or designations for types of time. So the chronos time is what we mostly live in, and that's where we get the word chronology. It's the time that we can measure by nature, and we can divide it up, and we can order our physical lives around it. I mean, our physical lives are already ordered by chronology. We just are assenting to divide up our time that way. And the history of how we've done this is fascinating. Some of the earliest clocks were designed to follow the sun. You had to have the clock at the right latitude and longitude. You couldn't move it because it was designed to put the liturgy of the hours at dawn, and that dawn would change throughout the year. So it was mechanized to the point that the liturgy of the hours thing would pop up. And this is from the 1500s. The liturgy of the hours thing would pop up at the right minute throughout the year, even as the dawn changed, but then the hours were fixed. It's fascinating.
Wow.
So they used to layer these times on top of each other in clocks, and we don't do that anymore, obviously.
Right.
But yeah, so there's chronos time, which is what we mostly live in. Then there's kairos time, which is where you can get a number of definitions and understandings of it. This is where I was reproached over a very delicious cocktail. So the way that I understand kairos time is that it is right time or appropriate time. It's where chronos time aligns and then transcends itself and becomes suited. And the example that I use here is the passage from Ecclesiastes where the poet writes, "There is a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to destroy and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance." Clearly, he's not saying there's a right hour to do these things. What he's saying is that there's a fitness or a fullness or an appropriateness to doing these things in their proper season in relation to God and to that which is beyond time. So kairos time is the bringing of chronos time into relationship with eternal time, eternal rightness, that which is suited for the moment. So the best example I can give is we go to church on Sundays. It doesn't really matter what time you go to church on Sunday. It matters that you go to church on Sunday because there's a kairos cycle to our lives where we must rest on the 7th day or the first day, depending on how you want to make your calendar, because that is to submit our chronos calendar to kairos time.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
It does, yeah.
Okay, and then there's that third category, which gives us the word eon, and it's time which is in eternity. So it would mean, and I don't know how the Greeks would think about it in light of these things about time being heat exchange. I don't know if they would say that this kind of time ceases to exist. There's a research topic for someone out there. But
there
basically they would...
It's your commission from Jane Scharl.
There you go. Yes. I can't pay you, but I'll read you.
Exactly. She'll endorse you.
Yes, I will. So yeah, there's this third category time, which I don't really get into, but basically it's time has eternity, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's
that's
so
helpful.
No. It's wonderful.
Okay.
This whole chapter is mind-bending, and that's why I love it. And you pull in the theology with the science in. Yeah, it's brilliant. So you also say here, kind of like we go back to the linear part, you kind of pull in the landscape bit of it.
Okay.
So you say at page 39, you say, time is much less of a linear progression than it seems. Rather, it is a landscape in which we wander. Just as a mountain does not disappear when we can no longer see it, moments do not disappear once we are no longer living them. I really, really like that. I also think that one of the most compelling arguments in your essay about this is the suggestion of viewing landscape as time instead of linear progression, because if I'm not mistaken, and if I am, please correct me, you claim that if we kind of adopt this view, we can almost use it as a weapon of sorts against some spiritual warfare. And it sounds outlandish the way I put it that way, but bear with me because you put it so much better. And again, here I quote, the devil has managed to turn time into a double-edged sword, slicing at us with nostalgia or regret over the past, and poisoning us with dread or abstract ambitions about the future, distracting us entirely from the present, our nearest analogy to the experience of eternity. And I couldn't help but think of C.S. Lewis in his Screwtape Letters here, too, where the entirety of the purpose of the demons is to distract the humans just enough away from God and to suck them deeper into their own understanding of their world and their time and how to use it to their advantage rather than offering it back to God and thus being free to live outside its restraints. So if I'm like off a field or, please correct. But I did think that was kind of an interesting thought. And what further insight do you have on that? Or
I don't think you're off. I like hearing people put things in their own words because it makes it gives me new insights into these ideas. But I think that's what I'm saying in, the Christina way. I think that's right. So
the much less eloquent.
Well, no, I think it's good. Because I think that when we think of time as our sort of our native landscape, the reality is, this is my second favorite mystery, my second favorite theological mystery.
Nice.
The reality is that at one point, God was all spirit. And then Christ ascended into heaven and took a physical body and took everything that has to do with physicality into heaven. And now physicality sits on the throne of heaven. That is insane to me. I'm going to cry about it. Because that means that time is not something that we are just going to escape. It's not like we're mice in a maze that God has trapped us in, and at the end of days, he's going to lift a gate and we'll get out and we'll be done with time. No, time is somehow part of eternity now because Christ has a body. Bodies transfer heat within themselves. The transfer of heat and change and all of that within physicality, Christ has a real human body. And that means that somehow time is part of God. I don't know what that means. I don't know how to explain that, but it's real. That's in the Bible. So to me, that means, because Christ's body it redeems all of mankind. So the elements of change and time that are within Christ's body are redeeming all the elements of change and time that all of humanity is experiencing if through faith we allow him to do that. So that means that all of my time, all of your time is part of heaven. And this makes me cry because my mom also has passed away recently.
Yeah.
And there's that fear, at least for me, a significant part of the grief there is you feel like so much is lost.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And my mom's mom just passed away. Sorry. And it feels like my mom is utterly lost because no one remembers my mom as a child, as an infant. It's gone. But that's not true.
Right.
The time element of my mom's life is preserved in God. And I believe that one day we will all be able to walk the times of each other's lives and see God at work in those times. So to me, this is all theoretical and very interesting and philosophical and also really important because for me, as I try to learn how to live in a physical world where my mother is so gone, it's freeing to believe that she's not really gone, and I can let her go because I'll get her back.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I hope that's helpful.
Nope. I mean, it is. And I was having the same thoughts this morning as I was crying over the anniversary. And I mean, welcome to life, guys. Yeah. This is on our podcast. Yep. This is real life.
Read theoretical physics and cry. This is it.
This is life. Yes. But again, I was thinking of how deeply Satan wants us to live in that grief and that loss, and the hope that is offered, the indwelling of God within time and within us, and bringing us constantly back to Himself is way more than we can comprehend, and it gives us that hope. And so, kind of like when you back to your quote, and the devil turning time into a double-edged sword, slicing at us with nostalgia or regret, or of course like grief, poisoning us with dread. Like it's taking us away from that moment of experiencing Kairos and knowing that all of this is still contained in God.
Yeah. I really believe that. And I think that the turn is that when we believe that, we are free to just live in the present.
To be.
And that's something, when you look at the saints, the lives of the saints, they're all so different and so weird. They're incredibly quirky people. And you think about, I'm not sure I would actually enjoy hanging out with most of them.
I've had that thought too.
Oh my gosh, they're so intense. Yes, they're really hardcore. But I think that a lot of that is because they're not living in the past and the future. They're living in the present. They're seeking to bring God into the present. They are trying to become these channels. And the more they do that, the weirder they get, because they get less and less consumed with the things that sort of level us. I've got to save money for my retirement, or I'm kind of feeling guilty and paralyzed because I feel like I wasn't good to my mother in her final days. Those things cripple us.
They do.
They cripple us, and they make it impossible for us to move God through us in that kind of radical, saintly way. Yes. So I think that's where it becomes a moral or an ethical thing of when we stop worrying about time as a linear progression where we're going to miss out, and we start thinking about it as, wow, my child will never be 2 years old again. But also my child is always 2 years old. Yeah. And I can live in a way where that is eternally present instead of I'm regretting that I wasn't present enough with my child as a 2-year-old. Yeah. Then you can just be present with your child as a 5-year-old because you don't have to worry about when they're 2 or when they're 18. You just have to worry about where they are now. And I think that helps us be more like the really weird saints, which I think is a good thing.
It is.
Be weird.
Be weird, be a saint. There you go.
Yes. It's not a direct line.
No, there's some wibble wobble, tiny whiny things going in there. Yes. If I quote Doctor Who, which is, let's not do that. I don't think he has quite the wisdom, good old Doctor Who, but that's okay. It's a great show, but... or at least the older versions. So, I think just, I know we're running low on time.
Sure.
But which is just amazing.
No, we're not.
But I do want to throw in this one quote here before I go to your last question.
Okay.
And this is back to the beginning of the scene, at the very beginning of the chapter. And this is what you say: if we do not hesitate to pray for a fellow human separated from us by half the globe, i.e. my father in Michigan. That's me. I said that. Sorry. Those are my lines. That was a close quote again. We ought not to hesitate to pray for someone separated from us by such a trivial thing as time. So, you can interpret that in many ways.
This is a little trippy.
This is trippy. This is very trippy. So you'll have to read her full chapter if you want to deal with that some more, unless you want a closing line to sort of clarify that.
I think no. Just pray for whoever you want to pray for.
The Lord hears it all.
The Lord hears it all, and I know that this can get a little uncomfortable for people with, do we pray for the dead? Yeah. Pray for the dead that at the moment of their death, they received the grace that they needed. And guess what? That prayer has power. It really does. You can't pray that someone who rejected God will after death receive God. That's beyond the pale. But so the thing there's a Mormon tradition that you can in fact atone for the dead. You can't atone for the dead, but you can cast your prayers back so that the dead, asking for grace for the dead while they lived, and that can happen. God is outside of time, so if God can know in his infinite foreknowledge that you're going to pray for that, and he can answer your prayer before it's prayed. There's nothing logical or theologically inaccurate about that. It might make people feel a little weird, but if you stop and think about it, it makes sense. It's about asking for grace. Grace is outside of time, and your request, once you've made it, goes into eternity, so it's outside of time, so they can talk to each other. It's fine.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's not that weird.
Not at all. But it's beautiful. It is beautiful. And I think it does open up our minds and our horizons and our hearts to stepping outside of Chronos time and stepping into God's time. So in whatever way any reader will decide to sort of look at that passage, weird or not, I'm hoping, as it did for me, to just really open the door to saying our God is bigger. Our God is way beyond what we can possibly imagine. I don't need to be afraid to be rooted in this time and place, and I need to embrace it because my God contains it and all other time within himself.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, okay, last question. Just back to the book itself. So I'm going to give a little Amazon moment right here because you can find this book on Amazon right now. And so here we go. This is the blurb that we have. God creates. God invites us to subcreate with what he has made. God meets us in the work. Have you ever wondered why humans create things? Or how to connect your own creativity with the God who gave it to you? Wonder no further. Because in Why We Create, we learn the creative rhythm that shapes our lives and how to join in God's own creative work. So you can find that on Amazon, you can find it on our website, but I wanted to tie that whole concept back to your chapter, Jane, and ask, how do you think that this whole concept of time is important to understanding our Creator and why we create?
That's a really good question. Well, we create because God creates, and we participate in the image of God. So there's the Aristotelian definition of man as a rational animal, and I don't think that gets it. I think man is more than rational. Man is there's all kinds of, everybody has their own spin on what this is. I read one recently, man is a metaphysical animal, and I love that one. I've read man is a praying animal, man is a contemplative animal. What is the thing we do that nothing else does? And I would say man is a subcreating animal. We alone look at what we've been given and we transform it. We apply that divine power of giving meaning where before there was none. Or there was latent meaning, because obviously we're only working with the materials God has given us. So that's what we are as humans. When we start to think about, we usually think about that, we think about subcreating in terms of like material. So we think about, we are creating with wood, with language, which is a material thing. Don't get me started on that, because language is an object, people. But when we start to think about time as something else that we can create with, it can change the way we create. So if you're you can think about it in terms of we live in an era, we live in a moment in history or something like that. Well, your work is, you're working with the materials that your time has given you. So you need to master the forms that have come before you, and then don't worry about the past or the present. Or the past or the future. Work in your present. Exist in your present with the best forms that you can create in your time. So that's one way of thinking about time and creation. Because I think some people get hung up on, is my work going to be lasting? It doesn't matter. Whatever you make it the best you can for now, because everything will last. Nothing of God will be lost. Mm-hmm. So make your work of God and it will be eternal. That's it. Doesn't matter if someone reads it tomorrow. It doesn't matter. It's part of eternity. It's woven in. So I think that's really important, because I think sometimes people get wrapped up in, are we engaging the future? Is this urgent? It doesn't matter. Just make something that is to the best of what you can do with the gift you've been given of being now. And being now means there's the whole past that you can learn. You can master the forms of the past and then just make. So that's where I think, to me, it's freeing, because when you stop thinking about, my art is happening in the middle of a linear progression and I have to address what came behind and set the stage for what comes before. No. That's death to creativity.
It is.
It's death. As soon as you begin thinking about what is the response to my art, you're going to stop making art and you're going to start making either propaganda or something that is just it's just flabby. Mm-hmm. What art is, it's a response. It's not making so that someone else responds. I don't know.
As tempting as that is.
No, I don't know if that makes sense. So your audience is the best people you know. They might be dead. A lot of the time I'm making art for people who are dead, because if what I make is really good, those people will see it. They will experience it in some degree or another, So I think when you begin to think about time as a landscape and your creation as a monument in that landscape, and you don't think about your art as part of a chain,
right,
then it's really liberating. And this, if you want more on this, T.S. Eliot did a lot of work on this. His essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, he talks about how what is made now actually changes past art. That there's this conversation between the past and the present, and our contribution transforms the art that already exists. And I love that idea that when we're making, it's like we're carving in a room, and there's all these other carvings, and what we make changes the way that people see what has already been made. It's just a really liberating way to think about it. So does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Is that helpful? Okay.
100% and more.
Good.
Yes, I love it. I just get so excited thinking about this stuff. It's so freeing and it's so
good,
encouraging, and just makes me want to go create.
And I hope people can just remember Julian of Norwich. Mm-hmm. She just says, all shall be well. All shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And when we blend that with these ideas of time, to me, it means you can do harder work, because all shall be well, and that nothing of God will be lost, and it takes the pressure off of you.
Yes.
That would be my closing note.
Wonderful. So with your closing note, where can we find more of your work?
Yeah. Okay.
Creative and otherwise.
Okay, sure. So I've written a verse play in which I actually talk about a lot of these ideas, but in an interesting and dramatic way, not in a philosophical way. It's called Sonne la Matina. It's French, so it's spelled interestingly, but if you just look me up on Amazon, it comes up. And that's probably my favorite thing that I've done. And I'm working on 2 more verse plays to accompany it and kind of round out some of these ideas. Then I also publish a lot of essays and other poems, and you can see those things sort of compiled on my website, which needs to be updated, and I will do that. But it's J.C. Scharl, S-C-H-A-R-L, so JCSCHARL.com, and you can sort of see just a number of things that I'm working on.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was really great.
Absolutely. Our conversations on whatever we want and Ken's Kiss and time have come to an end because things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once Again Believed to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. To find out more about the Anselm Society, please visit us at anselmsociety.org. And while you're at it, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.